Well, hello, everyone. I think I'm going to get started. It's a couple minutes past 1:30. People are still arriving, but hopefully by the time I'm done giving all the intro spiel, everyone who wants to be here will be here. My name is Paul Gellert, and I'm the Director of Global Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology here at UT. We are recording, and also if you know someone who couldn't make it who's interested, we'll be posting that to Global Studies YouTube channel afterwards. So today is the fourth in a series of interdisciplinary events that Global Studies is organizing this year, and we plan to continue into next year on the broad theme of the US in the globe and the global in the US, a view from the Southeast periphery. Before we start, as usual, I want to thank our sponsors who are making this possible, and with all good luck and vaccinations to make this possible to have people meet in person next year. The Haynes Morris Endowment Fund, first and foremost, but also the Center for Global Engagement, Daisy Shen, who helped create our flyer, the departments of Sociology, History, Political Science, and Anthropology, and interdisciplinary programs in Africana Studies, Asian Studies, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and Middle East Studies. I also want to thank my partners in this effort on the organizing committee, Tora Olson from History, Asafa Jalata from Sociology, Tamara Gilbertson from Sociology, our two undergrad leaders, Callista Boyd and Lily Hardwick, and they are active on helping us out with our Facebook page for Global Studies. If you have ideas for the future, get in touch with any of us. Globalstudies.utk.edu is our website, our YouTube channel, Facebook I just mentioned. So today, as many of you may know, is a roundtable that continues a conversation that we started a couple weeks ago. We had an interdisciplinary panel discussing the global in the US South that focused on immigration, immigrant experiences, and the ways in which the South has been shaped by its connections to Latin America and Asia in particular, and built by Latin Americans and Asians in Houston, North Carolina, and elsewhere. Our next event, before I turn over today's event, is on March 12th, and I'm just going to quickly put this up here and share. This will be on March 12th with a focus, that's a week from today, focus on US intervention in the world. Jeffrey Robinson is going to speak on Psy-War, Guns, and Silence, US Intervention and the Indonesian Genocide of 1965-66. Bonnie Holcomb is going to speak on the many faces of US intervention in Ethiopia, which has been in the news again of late. And Eric Becker will be speaking on Ecuador under the imperial gaze of the FBI and the CIA. And I'll put a link for that in the chat. We hope that a lot of you will be able to join that one as well. Today's event features 4 activists and student activists among them on the theme of criminalization of immigrants and how communities exist. Dr. Megan Connolly is going to be facilitating. She's an assistant professor of practice and director of our community partnerships program in the Department of Sociology. She's also co-author of a couple works, one with Stephanie Bohan, our department head, on immigration and population that came out about 5 years ago with Polity, and a more recent book that's more relevant to today's conversation, I think, called Immigrant Rights in the Nuevo South, Enforcement and Resistance at the Borderlands of Illegality. She also made the news this year, as probably some in the audience are already aware, for winning a victory, although I gather the case is still ongoing, against the Knox County Sheriff's Office in trying to ensure that public records are truly available to the public. So I am going to let Megan introduce our speakers and explain how the remainder of the session goes. Oh, sorry, I did have one thing on the way the Zoom session goes. I think many of you are familiar and already doing this. We're running this as a meeting so we can see each other eventually. During the speaker presentation part, if you can sort of turn your screen off and mute yourself, and leave that to the speakers, the primary speakers, and then maybe come back on in the last portion when we want more audience participation. Thanks a lot. And the floor is yours, Megan.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And I also want to thank Global Studies, and especially to Paul Gellert and Tori Olson for inviting me to put together this panel, to Daisy Shin for creating the flyer for the event, and to all the departments and the people on campus and community organizations for helping to advertise the event. I also want to thank our invited speakers who graciously agreed to use their time and energy to share their experiences and expertise with us. And thank you as well to the audience for committing to one more Zoom meeting right now, and especially on such a beautiful day here in Knoxville. As Paul said, my name is Megan Connolly, and I'm an assistant professor of practice in the Department of Sociology here at UT. And I am also a co-founder and steering committee member of AKIN, Allies of Knoxville's Immigrant Neighbors. When Paul and Tori first invited me to think about the story of the global in the US South, I immediately thought of the organizing and mobilizing efforts here in Knoxville in defense of the rights and dignity of immigrants and against criminalization. And I thought about how our efforts to resist criminalization at their core are also about building community, about envisioning and crafting the community that we want to inhabit. For me, this is a community in which all people are recognized as fully human in all their complexities, with all their accomplishments and their mistakes. In this community that I long for, people's worth is inherent. It is not measured by birth certificates or visas or passports, nor is it gauged by our contributions, our successes, our sacrifices, or even the harms we may cause. So as I was planning this roundtable for today, it felt particularly relevant to let this be a conversation about community, about our community. And with the questions I have prepared for today in consultation with our speakers, I'm asking all of us to be in deep conversation with one another about the meaning of our work, our relationships to one another, and our relationship to Knoxville. The speakers here today are all deeply committed to immigrant rights and to anti-criminalization work. But I would like to note that I feel a great deal of gratitude for the fact that there are many people across the greater Knoxville area, including many people who are in the audience right now, who are equally committed to this work and who have much to contribute to this conversation. I very much look forward to the open discussion that will follow after our speakers have time to respond to the prepared questions. So without further ado, I am going to turn things over to our panelists who have asked to introduce themselves. Please tell us a little about who you are and tell us a little about the organization or organizations you represent. And maybe I'll just invite people as I see them on my screen. Let's go with Hammad first.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you guys can join us, and thank you for putting this together. My name is Hammad Sheikh. I am an attorney. I'm an immigration attorney in Knoxville, Tennessee. I have a private law firm. I'm also on the board of Adelante, which primarily does educational workshops. We, on occasion, we'll take on pro bono removal cases. Part of the reason we started this organization, and they're, prominent members who are on the board of Adelante. We started this organization in terms because we saw there was a huge disconnect in terms of the information that is needed for someone to protect their rights, right? And they don't necessarily have access to attorneys, immigration attorneys, or as we'll talk more, like one small piece of information can make or break your case, right? Like you miss one court hearing, you're going to end up with a deportation order, right? And, as a lot of removal defense immigration attorneys are seeing the past 2 weeks, the judge has signed an order, like there's a scheduling order, signed it like 5 weeks ago, immigration court sent it like 2 weeks ago, and the deadline is like next week, right? Like essentially, ideally it would be like 30 days, 60 days, but like that's how immigration court is running. But I also teach asylum law at UT law as an adjunct. Hopefully I can answer all the questions that you guys have. I'm really glad that we're able to talk about this issue.
Thanks, Hammad. Natalie, would you like to introduce yourself and the organization you're here to represent?
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Natalie. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm gonna try to be on camera, but I live in a really rural area. So if it gets spotty, Megan, just let me know and I'll go off. So yeah, like Megan said, I'm here representing ICE out of East Tennessee. And for folks who don't know, ICE just stands for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which is kind of like a branch from the Department of Homeland Security that's involved in like surveilling, caging and deporting immigrants in the United States. And so ICE out of East Tennessee started in the summer of 2019. And really, I mean, conversations had been happening prior to that time, but sort of in the summer of 2019, a bunch of like local folks got together, folks that had been like witnessing immigration work, had been experiencing state violence, and also were immigrants themselves, to talk about like what can we do in a grassroots way to like formally organize. And so our group was founded. Even though we have, we explicitly name like one agency, ICE, in our name, when we like know that ICE is just like one apparatus of racial capitalism. And so when we say ICE out of East Tennessee, what we're really trying to portray is any agency that works on the state's behalf, on racial capitalism's behalf, to surveillance, cage, detain and deport, and murder our people. And so that includes like ICE, obviously the Department of Homeland Security, but it also includes like the Knoxville Police Department, the Knox County Sheriff's Office as examples. And we primarily do work in Knoxville and Jefferson County. So yeah. I also mentioned that we're, if you couldn't tell, we're pretty explicit about being abolitionists. And we're also approaching the work from a transnationalist perspective. And really like we're anti-racial capitalists and look at this work through an intersectional framework.
Thank you, Natalie. Luis, would you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be here and sharing this space with y'all. My name is Luis Mata. I use he, him, él pronouns. I have the great privilege of being one of the co-founders for Students for Migrant Justice. Our other co-founder, hello, Taylor, you're in this call. Thank you. And you know, what really gathered like us to want to essentially start Students for Migrant Justice was the fact that we saw kind of like what Hammad was kind of talking about, like that disconnect, you know, in spaces where building power amongst the people could be incredible, right? And we saw that disconnect with the campus at the University of Tennessee with the greater Knoxville community. And, you know, we've been committed to educating folks about the immigration system, mobilizing with our incredible community stakeholders and organizations. And, you know, the most important thing, what we keep at the forefront is to build power among student immigrants and to center student immigrants and all migrants in our community. I also have the privilege of working at the Office of Immigrant Services, as well as, you know, being a student. So I'm super glad to be here with y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. And Sarah Margaret, would you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Hi, I'm Sarah Margaret Hutchison. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here representing AKIN, which stands for Allies of Knoxville's Immigrant Neighbors. And I guess I first joined with AKIN in 2016, early 2017, maybe, after the election, and maybe before the election. I was trying to think of it earlier today, and I just couldn't really remember. But around that time period, when finally I kind of realized I needed to do something to live out my principles. Yeah, I feel that especially as a colonizer living on stolen land, it's crucial to push back and just sort of oppose the narrative that some people don't deserve to be here, especially Indigenous people, people of color. I just think, I mean, have that responsibility. So yeah, and AKIN works a lot through education. We do a lot of sharing news on our social media channels. We work really hard to educate other white people, and we also work in coalition with other organizations in Knoxville. And a big focus of our work for the past, I don't know, almost decade has been to oppose 287G in Knoxville. And we're also kind of diving into some of this public records stuff as a result of Megan's amazing lawsuit, because it does directly relate to 287G and immigration enforcement in Knoxville. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you, Sarah Margaret. Well, I'll just kick us off with the first question, and I invite all of our panelists to jump in as they are willing and able, and as they feel that they have something to say, either in response to the question itself or in response to one of their panelists here today. So our first question, what does it mean to you to organize for immigrant rights? What or who is included in the scope of that work?
I'll go ahead and kick it off. So what does immigrant rights, like organizing, mean to me? To me, essentially it means being committed to protecting the integrity, dignity, and unity of our communities, right? It means building power. Where there's power, there's people. That's what we always preach. So that is who's also included in the work that we do, to build power with those who are committed in this work, and committed to centering the lives of those who are directly impacted. Organizing for immigrant rights to me means deepening your own analysis, deepening your own commitment, and analyzing just how deeply the issues really go, right? And not just viewing it from a surface level aspect, if you will. I guess kind of like what I prepared for the specific question was, to me, organizing for immigrant rights can be perfectly summed up with the words of an undocumented poet named Yosimar Reyes. He says, "Giving because we know about longing, and we give not because of our own guilt or praise, but because we are all a bond, we are interconnected, we weather the same storms, and we are all a community." That's what immigrant rights mobilizing means to me.
I'll follow up on Luis, answering that question. Absolutely, I agree with him like 100%. In terms of like the passion that's needed to organize for this scope of work, but also, like the last, I would say, like I got into immigration rights essentially because I was interested in human rights law, and like and I was like, you don't necessarily need to leave America to do human rights work, and asylum law was the closest thing pre-Trump era, like that I found, was close to human rights law, but. Like also like 287G, ICE raids, like that simply like like made the situation worse for immigrants, right? Like, so in terms of like the scope of work, I don't want to, even though most of my work deals with asylum seekers, people who are in deportation proceedings, or people who are stopped at the border, or who are picked up due to the 287G in Knox County. Like the scope kind of goes further than that, because US citizens are affected, right? Like you can have people living here for 15, 18 years, they've been paying taxes, right? Like the number one question, I get asked is like, hey, I've been paying taxes for like, 17, 18 years. I don't have anything on my criminal record. I have kids that are going to school, like, or someone who's like essentially lived their entire life here. So no family lives in any other country, like, and the only thing is they're undocumented. And the question is like, why can I not? Like I'm like a productive member of society, right? Like, so what does it essentially mean to be a productive member of society? Like, and who's defining these terms? Because I can, off the top of my head, like list a few hundred people that are like, really productive in our society and should be given, legal status. And I was watching a, a lecture by Chomsky a few days ago, in which, like they described essentially in America, immigration system has created a caste system, right? And you have these castes going on, and they are trying to solidify that caste system in the public's mind. For example, if someone's picked up by 287G, the community, right, like who doesn't know what 287G is, who doesn't know how it affects people and that particular person, right? Like all they're gonna promote is anything is promoted from the police or from ICE or from Department of Homeland Security, oh, criminal, right? Like that person's a criminal, and then if people don't know what 287G is, they're gonna be like, well, okay, that makes sense. Someone got picked up. What they don't know is like driving without a license. Someone could be going to CVS, their kid is sick, stopped by the cop, and then now they have to pay like $7,000-8,000 just to get out of immigration jail, right? And that essentially, is just one of the problems. It's just like one of the problems that we're dealing with. I mean, I don't know if I answered the question correctly. There's just like so much to talk about in terms of, organization, in terms of the scope of the work. Um, you know, uh, yeah, I'll just stop right here.
Yeah, I can add something. I think like the question of like, what does immigrant rights organizing mean to me? It really means like being in a committed lifelong struggle for the liberation of our people. And the reason why I say that, because that's like super broad, but it's like immigrants aren't monolithic, right? Like, sure, it's an identity that millions of people share, but those millions of people also have other identities that are coming into contact with the state and are experiencing different kinds of state violence. And so when you think about immigrant rights as like an issue, it's really an issue within many issues that when you zoom back, you're looking at the state. And I like resonate a lot with what Hammad was saying about like the state has control over the narrative of our people. The state gets to say who's the criminal and who's not. And like the police and ICE are just like agents to monopolize on that violence. They get to say, well, you broke the law because of X, Y, and Z, and now you're going to be put in a cage or you're going to be expelled from this country, or you're going to have to pay massive amounts of fees and lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those things kind of like when they come into mind, it's like if you're an immigrant rights organizer, you're also an organizer for like queer and trans rights. You're also an organizer for folks that are being funneled into the money bail system. You're also an organizer for the liberation of Palestine against the Israeli occupation, right? Because it is encompassing, because all those issues are immigrant issues. And because like, again, like we're not monolithic people. And so it really is about like zooming out and looking at these systems rather than like our identity-based things that are impacting us.
I would say too, from my perspective, organizing around immigrant rights and for immigrant rights involves like a lot of listening and deference towards immigrant communities, and then on the other side of that, the opposite of deference, I guess, defiance and advocacy towards the state, because as a white person, someone with a body that doesn't get as much violence heaped upon it by the state, I have the ability to go up against those people with less harm to be done to me. And so I do feel like that is a big responsibility for me that I feel is to both listen and defer, and then at the same time take that information and try to, I don't know, use the privileges that I hold.
I want to bring our work here very locally and ask all of you to describe Knoxville or East Tennessee in terms of our community's relationship with or approach to immigrants and immigration. With respect to Natalie's comment that immigrants are not monolithic, and so our approach and response may not be monolithic. But how would you conceptualize Knoxville's approach to and relationship with immigrants and immigration?
So that question, right? Like I feel like there's like subpart questions, right? Like there's like a, like are we talking about in relation with ICE? Are we talking about in relation with relations with the police, or USCIS, or the Memphis Immigration Court, or like in general, right? So I mean, we also have to understand we're living in the South, right? Like, so one thing is like we're living in the South. Second thing is like Knoxville has primarily, I lived in Miami for like a decade, right? Like, so in terms of the immigrant community versus Knoxville immigrant community, like it's like a night and day difference. However, Knoxville has an ICE office. Like out of all the places, Knoxville has an ICE office here, right? Knoxville also had the 287G contract. So the government essentially, right? Like, so the powers that be kind of set the tone in terms of their relationship with the immigrants, right? Like, so the ICE is here. So in 2018, there was an ICE raid that happened in Morristown. Around like 90 plus people were detained. There were like a couple of hundred people, like who were affected by that. And then there's still research going on right now where the children have suffered with PTSD through those detentions. There have been a few cases against ICE because of the physical abuse that they did. So essentially, like when we're talking about just in relation, like just to hone it back to Knoxville, just to hone it back to like the South, living in the South, right? It's the authority, right? Like the government has decided that this authority figure or organization has power over immigrants, right? Like, so ICE, like when I've taken my students, not during the pandemic, pre-pandemic, I took my students to, just look at how ICE officers interacted with people who would go in for check-ins, right? And the language itself, right? Like, so we see it day to day, like people who are activists, the first few weeks for them, like, like they'll be extremely angry, but then if we see it day to day happening, right? Like it's powerful, like our emotional reaction is powerful, but someone who's never been to the ICE office and they see someone talking to another human being in such a demeaning way, first of all, they don't have access to bathrooms, right? Like, so uh, whether it's cold, whether it's raining, whether it's like 110 degrees out there, they don't have a shelter. And you have a line of immigrants coming in and just essentially being ordered around as if they're second class, human beings. I'm not gonna say citizens, but they're, like essentially they are being treated as if they don't have any rights, right? Like, so and my question is like, who sets the tone, right? Like they're not criminals. Like they're not criminals, regardless of how the narrative is being formed, right? Like people are allowed to go into another country to seek asylum. Like let's just clear that up. That's part of the human rights law that we decided. And under the Trump administration, we criminalized that, right? Like, so, the narrative changed, like nationally. That like, why are these people coming through? Well, they're coming from Honduras, they're coming from Guatemala. Like, have you seen those countries? Like, there's, like, and the bigger aspect is like our role as a country, our foreign policy that's affected them, so.
I definitely like to add on to what Hammad is saying, that like the narrative that's being perpetuated within our communities, like that is what is, exacerbating these issues that we see. You know what I mean? Like the anti-immigrant like narratives, the criminalizing from, like what we've been talking about, the state, I feel like the local law enforcements here have bought into that pitch, right? They've bought into ICE's pitch, and that's why, like especially here in our community, we see how this has been, like what Hamad's saying, we have an ICE office here. We are one of 2 counties that has 287G, right? Something that I like to say, I mean, I don't like to say, but we got invited, Susan Margaret Justice got invited to Vegas, right? Vegas, to talk about an alto polimigra, an end to ICE, basically, convening. And they had no idea that we were coming from East Tennessee. And this is like a nationwide organizing, like convening. And the example that they showed for end ICE basically was Knox County, not Tennessee, not Knoxville, Knox County. And, when we saw that, I mean, like that really like resonated with all of us, because oftentimes you think that like, oh, like you're not in the trenches, you have to be at the border to really face like the real issues, but it's like, no, this is happening like here, it's happening in our communities, and we have to be mindful of that, the perpetuation of that narrative.
What would a pro-immigrant Knoxville look like?
So a pro-immigrant Knoxville, right? Like, so ideally, a Knoxville that we wouldn't need to define it as pro-immigrant, right? Like all rights are respected, like whether, like we're talking, like Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like, so essentially like you have and it's, like, so we're talking about immigrant rights, but like all of these rights essentially are intertwined, because I mean, we're like we're talking on a narrow scale, but like historically speaking, you're like only white people were allowed to be citizens, right? Like, and then you're talking about Germans were not considered white. There was an anti-Catholic sentiment, right? And then only free whites, and then Black people were allowed to be citizens. I believe there have been like I think after that statement, like till 1920, I believe there have been like 50 cases to Supreme Court where they try to define whiteness, right? Like, and who is white and who can be a citizen. And these are, people applying for citizenship, and Supreme Court is essentially, they have like a scientific definition of whiteness, and then they have like a like the reasonable person standard, like, oh, would someone walking down the street look at you and think that you're white? And like, so, and they shift back and forth. So you look at these legal cases, like, so there's a narrative, I believe, like it's all these the anti-immigrant stance, like how the police brutality against the Black communities, right? Like they all stem from racism, and like till we accept you know, that the origin of all these sentiments is racist. Like, they can't say like, oh, they're coming in to take our jobs, right? Like, no, they're not. Like, you don't, you know, like number one, like if someone comes in, they don't even speak English and can take that job, like, come on, you know, like, and on top of that, they pay taxes. A lot of times they are, well, most of the time they are exploited, you know, like, so ICE raids happened at the slaughterhouse, or they happened at, you know, like at the farms. These people are not being paid like $60,000, $70,000. Like, they're not even paid minimum wage, right? Like, they're not even paid minimum wage. And then, you know, so when we're talking about pro-immigrant uh, Knoxville, what it would look like, I I hope one day it's, you know, like where we don't have to, uh, you know, fight for just the basic understanding, you know, of like, hey, these, you know, like there are particular groups in your community whose rights are being infringed upon. Please care, right? Like, essentially, that's just not needed in the future, ideal future. Like, we wouldn't need to have this discussion. This Zoom meeting would be like irrelevant in the future, essentially.
Yeah, and I think Hammad touches perfectly on the importance and you know what does intersectionality like mean in this work, right? Like migrant justice is climate justice, is workers justice, is LGBTQI plus justice, is anti-blackness, you know what I mean? And we have to keep all of these, you know, intersections within our work, and that's what a true pro-immigrant, right, pro-immigrant community will look like, a community focused on building communities of care, a collective well-being, not seeing it as an individualistic viewpoint of just immigrant rights, right? So yeah, and you know, a community that's investing in our people and not in incarceration, detention, over policing, right? That's what I think the ideal pro-immigrant Knoxville would look like.
Yeah, I I don't know that I have much to add to what Luis and Hammad put. I mean, I wrote down the same things, and I also included like a pro-immigrant Knoxville, being able to look at the 58 million and growing $58 million police budget, and moving that money from the
No,
police
that
department.
unmutes me.
Oh, did you want to say something, Janice? I keep going. Okay. Yeah, it looks at that $58 million budget that is going into the Knoxville Police Department, and it moves it into our communities so that we can co-create new structures and systems that aren't working against us to extract labor and perpetuate anti-Blackness and white supremacy, like Hammad and Luis were saying. And yeah, I like really reiterate what Luis said about like it's intersectional in the lens of like, you can't be pro-immigrant and also at the same time be sending police and bulldozers to like an area of Knoxville to completely like be violent and obliterate a community of houseless folks, right? So that's what pro-immigrant Knoxville looks like. It looks like making space for our people that are being marginalized and oppressed. You can't be a pro-immigrant and have a money bail system that keeps people incarcerated perpetually. Yeah, I don't know. I resonate with a lot of what y'all said, and I think that there's also really concrete ways of us doing that.
I have like a follow-up question in terms of when, you know, the panelists and the host, you know, because everyone's and anyone in general, it's you know, like, so we kind of like talked about like what a pro-immigrant or what a community would look like in terms of like human right, you know, like everyone's rights being protected. Like, so where we are now and how to get there, like I know as we've all worked together in some capacity, we've talked about this, just amongst ourselves. Like usually the first few minutes of our conversations is like, oh my God, did you hear this? Did you hear this happen? And it's a, meeting y'all is like a very emotionally challenging thing too, because it's just like like we all need a vent in terms of like everything that's going wrong in the community. But it's like, what are the steps, right? Because I know Megan, I know like Sarah, Natalie, Louise, like 287G, like we've been trying to get that like taken care of, but it's just like and that's just like one of the things, right? Like we didn't touch about the public charge rule, which was essentially the like the administration trying to make sure that people are not even able to sponsor their family members, right? Like these are US citizens who like they're blocking US citizens from sponsoring their family members, only making it more difficult to get sponsor documents, right? Like the financial documents. So if we look, we don't have enough time to go through all the laws that have been problematic, but like what steps, like, because if we try to fight each one of these, it's like a mine, each one of these will take years. um, so I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss in terms of like how do we get from here to there. you know
I think too, it's so important to think about. I mean, a lot of this stuff are policy, local or national policy, or even state policy, like the anti-sanctuary cities law we have in Tennessee. But then there's also like just the people, like racist rhetoric and racism within our community that also has to be addressed in order for Knoxville to be even safe for people of color and immigrants. And maybe like one way to do that might be to have community defense teams, like people who look out for each other, and we don't rely on like cops to respond for an incident of racial bias when it's like most likely a cop committing that incident. And I think it is like turning towards one another for support and offering our support to one another as well.
I think that was like a great point you mentioned, like in terms of intersectionality, right? Like, so like going back like 2001, like September 11, and then all of a sudden, the Muslim community like rights, being infringed upon. And then we're talking about, I mean, Black Lives Matter movement started after that, but essentially like their rights have been infringed upon like since the beginning, before this country was even formed. And the country, like the nation itself, right? Like whether it's the administration, regardless of whatever administration it is, like, and it's essentially like the people, like, you know, for a group of people that have been here since before this country has been formed and are still not given like like not like their rights, essentially like are being infringed upon, right? And you have a segment of the community that says like, no, your rights are not being infringed upon, right? Like, so it's like I feel like these reasonings just take different shape, whether they're talking about Black lives, whether they're talking about like Hispanic lives, whether they're talking about the LGBTQ community. You know what I mean? And it's like I feel like uh, the powers that be, like, they're not necessarily genuine in terms of their criticism against having these rights, right? Like, so they'll keep changing the argument, but the argument essentially is like, nope, you don't matter, like we matter. And like, so we're kind of like going against that narrative. And then every time some change happens, like we have to come up with like a new way to fight against that imperialism. And we're stuck in that fight when like it just keeps the ball goes to the next generation to make the change. Then the ball goes to the next generation to make the change. So it's, I mean, definitely it is frustrating. It's definitely frustrating in terms of like how slow the progress is.
I want to go a little bit deeper into this question that Hammad raised, which is that, all of us here, speakers and everyone else who's here on the call today, we all have different relationships too. We all have different histories with immigration and criminalization. And the people in our community who care about immigrant rights similarly come from a variety of different backgrounds. Some are immigrants, some are not immigrants. There are immigrants of different authorization statuses. There are Black people, brown people, indigenous people, and white people. There are working class and middle class. There are people of all sexualities and all genders, all gender identities. So with consideration to these different backgrounds, and this is kind of a big question, so answer whichever part of this you feel moved to respond to. How do we think about roles? How do we think about rights? And how do we think about responsibilities that people with different identities have to themselves, to one another, and to the work?
Yeah, this is definitely a great question. The way that I kind of interpreted it was the best way to answer that is, advocacy can have so many different iterations, right? And that's what we perpetuate within our members and then within Students for Migrant Justice, right? Some might not be directly affected, some might be allies, some might be part of different communities, you know what I mean? And what we say is that like your advocacy is just as important as the next. It's just as needed. It plays equal amount of a significant role within this work, right? And I think in that comes like, like recognizing like the role that each of us play in this work, right? And specifically our work needs to be centering Black voices in the immigrant rights movement, right? They're the ones that are often overlooked. They're the ones that are often overlooked and within immigrant rights organizations, even though kind of like what Hammad was saying was that they're the ones that laid out the framework for the migrant justice movement to even happen, right? And I think that that's always key in understanding and knowing who we're centering and recognizing that each role plays just as significant role within this work. And that goes in hand with what we kind of mentioned, with the intersectionality of this, like migrant justice, climate justice, all that, and I just think that it's important to know your role, know your privileges that you may have that others might not have. So yeah.
Right.
Building. Oh,
No, sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say, building off of what Louise said about knowing your role and knowing where you fit and recognizing your privileges. I think it's so important to really seek like within yourself, like discern and come to the knowledge of what can you do, what can you give. And I think a lot of times that's deeper than like, what do you want to give, what's comfortable to give, right? And we all have different roles, different places we fit in, and it's not necessarily, money. It can be time, it can be other skills, but like, what can you give, like honestly within yourself? What resources and stuff do you have that you could give even if it wasn't comfortable? I think that's really important to consider and honor.
Yeah, so I mean, we're asking very complicated questions, right? Like, so it's very difficult to answer these. And in terms of like identity, right? Like, so like whenever we talk about immigrant rights, whenever we talk about LGBTQ rights. Like I feel like those are subcategories. Like the overarching categories like human rights, right? Like, so if you believe in the freedom of expression, right? Like if you believe in the First Amendment, like it needs to be extended to everyone, right? Like you simply cannot say that, hey, I was born a citizen, I have these rights, yada yada yada, but then there are a group of people that don't have those rights, and I'm totally fine with that. That doesn't work that way, right? Like if you do that, then you are being, discriminatory, right? Like essentially, like by definition, you are discriminating against a group of people. And when we're talking about immigrants' rights, right? Like I consider that as, like human rights, right? Like so when someone is fighting against police brutality, they're fighting for human rights as well, right? Like so in terms of organization, I feel like um, I definitely have butted heads with different groups of people in terms of some people wouldn't show up for a Black Lives Matter rally, just simply because they bought into the narrative. However, they will show up for a pro-immigrant rally, and I'm like, I don't understand. Like, like how can you show up for one and not show up for the other? And you have like philosophical differences all of a sudden, like you. So the concept of rights is kind of like muddy, even like amongst people who are active, even amongst people who support one group, but they will not support another group, right? Like so, for example, like they'll support immigrant rights, or they'll like go and support the Black Lives Matter movement, but they won't support the LGBTQ community. Like that. They're like, that's where we draw the line. And I'm like, I don't think like in terms of drawing the line, like we're not it. We don't draw the line. Like we shouldn't be the ones that draw the line, because the line will be drawn more narrower and narrower over and over again. Like if you're gonna start discriminating, there's no end. There's like just no end to like how far we can discriminate. Like so like so when how we would want, like the golden, I'm not religious by any means, but the golden rule, like that kind of stands, like do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So it's just like, would you be okay, like if someone took your baby, you're going into another country, someone took your baby, like 3-month old, 4-month old, and then they put them in a jail, right? Like you would be totally fine with that? If not, then why would you allow that to happen to someone else? Or why would you come up with arguments to argue that, what, that's what we should do? So I feel like there's like a disconnect in the way people think about these things too. Like, like they're, a lot of times their thought processes are only coming from talking points, right? Like they haven't thought these things through. There's like all emotional rage, but no, thinking in the background. Um, so I think that definitely causes a lot of problems, like in working in this as well.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back for a second to like the question that Hammad posed about what the steps are of this work, because I don't know, that's the exciting question for me. It's like, yeah, what are the steps? And like the recognition that these systems that we're talking about are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And campaign work, often we think about it, it's like, oh, this policy is coming up, we have to get together and we have to protest and we should override the policy. And campaigns often take like many years, right? And very often the wins aren't as clear cut as like we overturned the policy or like this person got to stay or not. And so like I really resonate with what Sarah Margaret said and what Louis said earlier, right? Like the steps for me, or how I see them, are that first and foremost, it's about building power. And building power is just getting people together to be able to exercise their demands to the people who do have power currently in the system. And like building power to do two things: to first challenge what's already here. So that's like looking at the police department budget of $58 million that doesn't actually come to help us at all, but instead like cages us and surveillance us and is murdering people. But it's also looking at like 287G, right? This policy is coming up and we need to get together to change that. And on the other side, with what Sarah Margaret said, it's building people power so that we can create. And create alternatives is actually a really powerful tool that's already being done in Knoxville in a lot of different ways. Like, you know, I think about the city council movement, CCM, that hosts like people's movement assemblies. And those are just like people get together to horizontally exercise their needs and wants, right? And identify issues. You know, I think about like Black Mama's Bailout, who's like actively bailing out Black folks, trans folks, queer folks, immigrant folks from cages, because we know that like the bail system disproportionately targets people of color. And like groups like East Tennessee's harm reduction that is literally out there doing mutual aid with houseless folks and community folks. And even ICW East Tennessee's own, like, I forgot to mention this earlier, but we have a hotline. So when like people are out in the community and they come upon like ICE or they're stopped by the cops, like our hotline is meant so that somebody can call so that we can go and pay witness to the violence that's going to occur between you and the state, right? And you know, it's not perfect and it's not totally creating an alternative solution, but it's getting there, right? It's the building blocks of those processes. And I think like it can all feel really overwhelming, but again, this is a lifelong struggle. We're not going to overturn 500 years of racial capitalism, colonialism, like neoliberalism in like 20 years of organizing. And to the question of like, what can people do? I mean, yeah, I really resonate with Hammad's point about intersectionality, and like our work is to go deeper into our intersections and understand these systems. And also to understand that like, we can't organize our way into freedom within these systems. Like if you try to do that, what you're really doing is that you want a subset of people to be free while others remain non, right? Because these systems are made to exclude and include, right? So, and that's why it's important, like you can't think about like, well, let's organize for immigrants by like passing a policy that gives a pathway to citizenship for 3 million people. And it's like, cool, bet, chill. And yet, what about Black immigrants, trans immigrants, queer immigrants, disabled immigrants, right? So it's like recognizing that we can't work within the system because you inevitably will continue the legacy of colonialism in that way, but rather that we have to create new systems. And that's exciting. It's super exciting. It should be exciting for us. And then I'll just say on the side for like white folks or like folks that are citizens or folks that are existing with greater privilege, like I think one of the tasks is to like really move away from this idea of respectability. Like, look, y'all, I promise you that if by being respectable and polite with the system could have won something, it would have, right? So like our duty as people is to literally get involved. There's no reason why after this panel, every single one of y'all don't go into social media, follow each of our groups and get involved and start organizing. There's like literally no reason, right? But if specifically if you're a person with privilege, like really like work with yourself to analyze like, well, if I want to be in conversations with the sheriff, to ask the sheriff politely not to re-sign 287G, like really identify like why it's harder for you to put your body out there on the line and use your resources in a radical manner, right? I know I'm getting a little preachy, but you know, like I really believe what I'm saying. I really think that our duty, regardless of our identity, is to organize, and that there's really no excuse around it.
I'm going to use Natalie's comment as a launching off to my next question, which will be my last substantive question for today, even though I have dozens more. The Biden administration. The Biden administration made some big promises. It has made some big promises on immigration. How do you think the words or the work of this new administration will impact immigrant rights or immigrant rights organizing in Knoxville? I know y'all have some opinions about this.
So I think, you know, when it comes to the administration, I just think that we can't let any administration, regardless of who it is, right, use their language and let us get comfortable, right? Let us get comfortable with the proposed legislations, the signed executive orders. You know, we can't let ourselves get comfortable, right? Kind of, for example, the whole executive order behind the enforcement priorities, right? That basically what that meant was like, oh, okay, only if you are committing serious crimes, you will face some level of enforcement towards the deportation machine, right? Um, and a lot of y'all know a lot more of the legislation and laws of that, but and like with that, right, goes like right whenever that executive order was signed, there were like 30,000 Black immigrants that were deported, right? With that also goes the migrant facility for children that we've seen all over. You know, what is this? This is the new kids in cages, right? So this administration is just reconfiguring what imprisonment is. And, you know, this administration just continues to choose to enforce immigration detention and incarcerate people for not being born in the United States. We have to keep this in mind always and recognize that regardless of who is in the administration, our work continues, especially right now. The migrant justice, like us within the migrant justice, or any, you know, community of care building organizations are doing is to, you know, to come in bolder. What Natalie's saying is we don't have an excuse, you know, to not be out there and to not be organizing and mobilizing, especially in this time, right? Because when we do, we potentially run the risk of, you know, essentially validating this immigration system that we have.
So with the Biden administration, right? Like, so it's I remember like when the Biden administration was coming in, we like had a discussion, with a few colleagues in terms of like what do we expect from the Biden administration, right? And a lot of it that we were hearing from other colleagues or from other organizations, it was basically like, just erase what Trump did, as if as if that's like our that's the golden era of like immigrant rights or rights in general. No, like Obama was known as a deporter in chief. There was a reason for that. The kids in cages, like those cages were made under the Obama administration, right? Like the enforcement priorities, like they have to do research like in like deportation, like how it impacts, like U.S. citizens, like, like if people care about U.S. citizens' lives more than immigrant lives, like then, U.S. citizens are impacted significantly through these enforcement priorities as well, right? Like so, and then I have a problem with the administration making promises and giving false hope and then walking those back because they don't necessarily have, like they're not emotionally invested. It does not affect them whether DACA happens or doesn't happen, whether they pass like this immigration reform bill that's going to give rights to like undocumented. For them, they'll go home. They'll like they're just going to go to sleep as if like nothing happened to them because it won't. But like for a lot of people who are looking over their shoulder because we have the 287G, for them, like when they hear like one tweet, one news article, that is all that they need to see. And then you give someone a false hope and then you just take it away. Like that's just immoral, like, and I hope Biden administration lives up to the promises that they have made. But we were also gonna get $2,000 stimulus checks, but now they're like 1,400. So, like that's, like an Obama could have done a lot more than just DACA, and they didn't. Like so there was. It's not that like this is our first time that we have an administration in place that's situated to make a change. No, we've had administrations, previous administrations in place, and they didn't do anything. So it's just like we can't get complacent just by the sweet rosy rhetoric that comes out from the Biden administration. Like, you have to keep them in check, essentially.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said. And I also want to kind of imagine, like, imagine that maybe every promise that he's made is put into place and is put into action. And what would really change on a local level for us here in Knoxville? Like, what would actually concretely change? And perhaps 287G would be gone. Knox County Sheriff's Office would still be holding inmates for ICE to come pick up and take and continue to place into deportation proceedings. I mean, people would still be taken from our community and still be deported. And I think it's just important to consider like what the local impact really would be. And if that's good enough, if only fewer people are being taken, is that good enough? And I don't think it is.
Yeah, everything y'all are saying, and like, I appreciate Hammad bringing in Obama, cause yeah, like y'all, we've had liberal leadership before, and it's not amounted to much. And I mean, I think about, yeah, you know, like in 2012 when Obama signed the executive order for deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, and you know, like how much the immigrant movement, right? If we're gonna give it such a simple name, but how much the immigrant movement really struggled before, during, and after that, because you know, like undocumented youth who didn't fall or qualify for DACA, you know, really felt like y'all, like, you know, like y'all not showing up, right? Like we got, like some folks got DACA, and then like there was this win, and then there's this like millions of other people didn't. And also like in that moment, you know, like the narrative that really like rose through was this narrative of who's a criminal, right? So like youth were beginning to be seen as like non-criminals, and their parents were being put in this narrative of like, well, the parents committed the crimes. And also like immigrants who like are exceptional are not criminals, but immigrants who drink, who get, you know, who like maybe, you know, do other recreational drugs, who are, you know, doing some stuff that the state deems illegal, they're criminals, and they need to be like targeted, not the non-criminal immigrants. And like that's the intent of the liberal state, is to give us the breadcrumbs that can reinforce the separation that it already has created for us, right? And so like I would just say like, yeah, Biden got elected, and frankly, thank God, y'all. But also like big deal, because Biden is just another face for white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And really the sole role of Biden's administration is to perpetuate the liberal, like the neoliberal sort of like imperial project that it has aligned for itself, right? The state is never going to go against itself. So I'll just say that, like, not to put our faith into these federal agencies, but rather the faith in us to be able to get together and fight, and to remember the lessons that we learned literally only a couple years ago, but that are easy to forget because we're looking at these minimal wins.
All right, I'm going to open to questions for the audience in just a moment, so be thinking about your question. But I want to give each person, each speaker here, we're all organizers here. And so we're not just here to talk, although clearly we love to talk. But one thing we know as organizers is that one of the best ways to get people involved in the work is to invite them into the work. So to each of you here today, what is one action or next step that the people who are gathered in this space today can do to support, to promote, and to sustain immigrant rights, your organization, or other organizations? So just really quickly.
I think, like Natalie said, oh, sorry, Hammad. Lee, I think multiple people have dropped some really great links into the chat, and to follow those, and especially for white folks to commit to really like learning about our legacy as colonizers and this scope of like the entire country and the entire world, but also really zooming in on local, like the AKIN website has some really great resources and some really great historical knowledge as well, but just to really understand our role and how we fit locally and in the broader context as well.
Go for it, Hammad. What's your ask for Adelante?
So, like essentially, everyone that's present here today, like one of the ways, uh, you know, just pick any of the organizations that, like any of the speakers that are representing. Just like reach out to them, email them if you want to get involved, right? Like no one is gonna reach out to you and be like, you know what? Let me text this person and like, hey, can you come? Blah blah blah. Like you have to be like proactive in terms of there are a lot of actions going on, a lot of rallies that happen. Like like you have to be in the newsletter list or sign up for any updates that these organizations are doing, and you can get involved. I'll post a link for Adelante as well, and you guys can send us an email, and we can like anytime something new happens, you guys can get involved in that sense. Whether donate, show up, whatever you guys want to do.
Yeah, I mean, real quick. So I'll say like, take the leadership of Black and Brown folks, leverage your resources. So if you got money, donate that money, right? We know that statistically speaking, people that are poorer give more money to or donate more money to groups. Like if you got money, give that money to these groups and join the organizations. And I'm gonna also drop a couple of groups that aren't present, but are doing really amazing work. And one real simple thing is follow East Harm Reduction on Instagram, because at the hands of our city mayor, our houseless community is literally dying, right? So if you want to get involved today to help immigrants, like that is the place you go. Follow that and show up for your community members in this way.
Absolutely. And kind of what everybody's been saying, contribute the means, your resources, time, whatever it is, to organizations committed to mutual aid. There's a lot of those in our community. Not a lot, but the ones that we have are doing amazing work. Black Mamas Bailout, like Natalie mentioned, Community Defense of East Tennessee Harm Reduction, Adelante, AKIN, SMJ, everybody who has been listed already. Also, to know whose voices you're amplifying, centering the lives of Black and Brown folks in our community, know when to decenter yourself. And yeah, just keep on sharing resources with one another.
Okay, well, thank you to our speakers for responding to those questions. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, either in the chat, or feel free to turn on your camera and let us know if you've got a question. Moira, you have a comment?
I do. I love what Natalie and Luis are saying about when you're in a group following the lead of Black and Brown people and decentering your white self. The other thing I would say is hold other white people accountable. When you're in a group like that and you see a white person who is maybe not doing that, who is trying to talk over Black and Brown people, or who is wanting to talk themselves all the time or keep themselves the center of attention, don't leave it to other members, non-white members of the group, to hold those other white people accountable. Go ahead and step up and do some of that yourself.
Thanks, Moira. Questions from the audience? I did receive one question in the from someone who signed up for the event today, and they asked, how can we use our collective power to raise awareness and bring an end to detention and deportation? And some of that may have already been responded to during the talk, but if you all have any other examples or things to respond, how do we use our collective power to bring an end to detention and deportation?
I think this is a great question. I think it could be answered, with what we kept on talking about during this call, right? Like, to being committed, right? To like recognizing your role and being committed yourself to ending all of these systems rooted in white supremacy, rooted in oppression, and then these systems that have been alive for quite some time. And you know, they can end, right? I did the math the other day. I'm 8 years older than ICE right now, right? So these systems can end. We will end them. Get into the mobilizing movements like N287G, the work ICE Tennessee is doing, Adelante, everybody else. But yeah, I think to really committing yourself to, in every aspect that you're in and every space you're in, to be mindful of these systems in place and what you can do, you know, with your own self to essentially dismantle that.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, ICW Tennessee is currently engaging in a defund the Knoxville Police Department campaign. And that's a big thing, right? $58 million is no joke, although it's, you know, tinier in relation to other cities. So like, get involved, hit us up. Like, if you want to seriously like end deportation and incarceration, it starts with our police department. And with $58 million, we can do so much for our own people. And yeah.
Yeah, you know, like I completely agree with what everyone's saying, but also we have to have, you know, elected officials, right? Like, so in terms of like who we're gonna vote for, that kind of determines, you know, in terms of like policy decision making. But you know, like, but in terms of like getting involved on a practical level, you know, like it just comes down to like action, whether volunteering for an event, or, you know, donating something, or simply just, you know, educating yourself on what's actually going on into the community. Because, you know, like these conversations are happening, you know, whether people are involved or not, right? Like, and then this is the era of fake news, right? Like, so it's just, you know, like someone can just say hashtag fake news, and all of a sudden, regardless of how true something is, it just becomes muddy, right? Like, so the, you know, like especially like in the South over here, like, you know, like we definitely need any type of support, right? Like, whether moral support or physical support that people can give.
Any other questions?
Well, I'll jump in, Megan. This was terrific and really exciting panel. Coming from a global studies angle, of course, the question I'm going to pose is the more global one. I'm just curious, since you're all grounded in activism in this region or on UT's campus, particularly around the immigration issues, like, you know, I heard Natalie saying like transnationalism and connections to like the Palestine struggle, that's pretty far away from, I think, like immigrant issues in Knoxville. So I'm just wondering whether there are more direct connections that any of you are making to the sending countries of immigrants, the diaspora between East Tennessee and countries of origin of newer immigrants, anything along those lines.
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And you know, when we talk about Palestine and the occupation of Palestine by Israel, you know, we're looking at like a legacy of European and US imperialism, and sort of like, and also a legacy of colonization throughout the world. But like, I'm from Chile. My family moved to this country when I was 10, and we moved to South Florida. And, you know, when I was young and we moved here, it was a real struggle to be like, to exist in a country that I could just tell didn't want me, but also had created the conditions for my family and me to have to be here, right? Because in Chile, you know, like potentially like well-known or not well-known, Chile was like one of the first countries that the United States experimented on neoliberal policies, right? And so it set up the support to have a military dictatorship in the country. And my parents grew up on that. And, like, that dictator held some form of power till 2006, all because of the support that England and the United States gave it. And so, like, how does a person like myself end up living in a small community in East Tennessee? Well, it kind of comes down to, like, the ways that the United States in particular has pushed foreign policy in our home countries for, like, the imperial project, which is, like, such a broad thing. And, like, we can sit here and literally have, like, 4 hours of deep conversation about just how South America has been, like, the experimental ground for US imperialism. But those are some of the concrete ways to connect it. I mean, if you look at our compas coming from Central America, like, people don't just leave their homes because they want to leave their homes. I promise you, I wouldn't be here if I had to be here. Like, if it didn't mean that I needed to have moved here, right? And a lot of the reasons why there's existing poverty and like state violence in our home countries down in South America is because the United States, in one way, shape, or form, has informed the dictatorship that occurs in those countries, or the neoliberal policies that perpetuate the wage gap from, like, the really wealthy and owning class to everybody else. And of course, like, before that, you have the legacy of European colonialism that set up the seeds for poverty in these continents. That was a lot. That was a lot of stuff. But it's just to say that, like, if you look at our immigrant compas, every single immigrant compa, I promise you, can trace its existence to this country now because of some policy that the United States has pushed back in their home. And that's why we have to look at transnational organizing. It's not enough to not be racist towards immigrants here. It's like, how do we stop the United States from creating the need for migration to begin with?
But I just want to, like, follow up on that, like, like, that's, in terms of, like, practical examples, right? Like, in the 50s, the Guatemalan government was overthrown by us over bananas, like, and then, no, literally bananas. And then the Iraq war, like, led to 2 or 3 million people being displaced, right? And then we're the ones that did that. And then we had the Muslim ban. Right. And it's so weird to, like, if you look at, like, historically and just, like, compact it, it's just, like, weird. Like, 2 decades prior, we're the ones that are forcing people to leave their houses. And then, right after, we're like, no. You're just coming in to take our jobs. Like, what? So, and then when you look at Mexico in terms of, in the South, we, like, people like talking about gun rights, but what they don't know is, like, they actually did a study how many guns that came from the United States were used by the cartel, like, how many guns in Mexico were used that were sold from the United States. So, like, a lot of them, like, I mean, the rate was over 50% of the guns that were used, to commit murders in Mexico in gang violence came from Texas. They came from, like, United States. So and Mexico has, like, strict gun laws, right? Like, so Mexico has strict gun laws. So they're, where are the guns coming from? So in terms, like, we impact these countries where people are running away from. They're not, like Natalie said, they're not, like, nobody just is, like, is just sitting in their living room and, you know what, I'm gonna make, like, a few 100-mile journey, like, take all my belongings, leave my house, leave, whatever I own, and go into a country that I don't even speak the language of. Nobody does that. Like, you have to do that. There's a reason that you need to do that. Otherwise, you are not gonna survive, right? Like, so, like, we just, like, in terms of perspective, like, practically speaking, like, these are just a few examples, that have happened in the past few years.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add on to that, the role that, like, colonization and imperialism has on forced migration, right? And whenever you think of the word, this was really interesting. Whenever you think of the word mob, right, you think of violence, you think of guns or whatever it might be, right? The word mob is used to refer to, like, the people coming from Central America and, the people that are coming and entering through the US-Mexico border, right? And they're referred to as a mob, right? The word mob comes from the word mobility. So you see there the way in which even language is criminalizing and demonizing our migrant brothers and sisters, right? So yeah, I want to echo what was just said. In terms of action, in regards to this, I am going to put in the chat a book specifically on this called Border and Rule. Talks about global capitalism, global migration. I highly recommend you all read that to get a more deep analysis of how far the rot really goes.
I think we're right here at the end of our time today, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But I'm very grateful to our panelists for being here and sharing their experience and their expertise with us. I'm grateful to the audience for listening and for thinking about these issues. And I'm going to say I'm grateful to you all for following up on the things that our speakers asked you to do. I'm just going to put that out there, that that's the expectation. You came here, you asked for it, and so I know you're going to follow up with it. Please feel free to reach out to me if there are ways that I can help support your engagement in Knoxville. There are many people on the call today who are already active and involved. And for those of you who are looking for new ways to be involved, I hope you will leave this session with some new information for what you can do. So thank you all again, and thank you to Paul for helping to get this organized. What else do we need to do here, Paul?
That's it. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all so much.